Hello, dear students. So, last lecture, we together read a poem by William Wordsworth. And we, in addition to understanding the meaning of the poem, we highlighted some literary devices. For example, we talked about the poetic form of the ode. We talked about alliteration, personification. So with every text, we are going to highlight a few things that we need to understand about any literary text. This time we are doing another poem. And the interesting thing about it is that it's very short, a very short poem. And this poem is called Fire and Ice. Fire and Ice is written by the American poet Robert Frost. And this is the poem. Only this, what you can see in front of you on the screen. Let's first read the poem and then talk about the poet and the context of the poem. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I have tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and wood suffers. A very short poem that apparently speaks about the end of the world. This is very clear in the first line. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. Okay, let's speak a little bit about the poet and the context of the poem, and then we go back and explore the poem deeply. Fire and Ice is a popular poem by the American poet Robert Frost, and these are his dates. He was born 1874 and died 1963. The important thing about this poem is that it was written and published in 1920. 1920. And this is shortly after the end of the First World War. WWI is an abbreviation of the First World War. You know, the First World War erupted in 1914 and lasted for 4 years, so it ended in 1918. So a poem about the end of the world shortly after the First World War. And this poem, it weighs up, it contemplates the probability of two differing apocalyptic scenarios represented by the elements of the poem's title. Now let's begin from the end. The elements of the poem's title are fire and ice. So the poem contemplates, weighs up, thinks of, or brings up the probability of two different scenarios for the end of the world. Now, instead of saying the end of the world, we can use the word apocalypse, and the adjective would be apocalyptic. So what is it about? Now, the speaker believes fire to end the world and links fire directly with what he has tasted of desire. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. I agree with those who favor fire. So he's equating desire and fire. But then we notice something about the tone of the poem. It is a conversational tone, as if the poet is holding a very simple, spontaneous conversation. And then he adds that ice, which represents hate and indifference, could also be great as a way of ending the world. So from what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it of course here refers to the world, if it had to perish, to end twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. So at the beginning, he agreed with those who favor fire, and he equated that with desire. And then in a very spontaneous way, he said, but okay, if the world is going to end twice, then I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great. So he is equating ice with hate and indifference. What does that mean? One thing you need to know, in addition to the fact that this poem was written shortly after the First World War, in 1920 in particular, many critics claim that this poem is inspired by Dante's Inferno. Dante, who wrote the Divine Comedy, Al-Commedia al-Ilahiyya. And Inferno is one of the parts of this comedy, Al-Jahim. It is basically a poetic and literary journey into hell. But that was written in the 14th century. We are not sure, but some critics claim so, that the poem of Robert Frost was inspired by Dante's Inferno. Of course, because, a journey into hell, and in this poem, we're talking about the end of the world. Okay. No, the tone of this poem is very light and conversational. And of course, it's ironic, but we'll come to this later. But despite this tone, which is light and conversational, Fire and Ice is a bleak poem, a dull poem, because it talks about the end of the world. It highlights human beings' talent for self-destruction. Because actually, what he says in this poem is that it is our actions and emotions that are going to end the world. So in spite of the light tone, the poem is bleak, dull, because it shows how evil human beings are. Now, the poem is a work of eschatology. Eschatology, this is how you pronounce it. eschatology, and I have highlighted this in yellow, meaning it's writing about the end of the world. If you go down the bottom of the screen, I have jotted down the meaning of eschatology and apocalypse. So eschatology means a belief concerning death, the end of the world, or the ultimate destiny of humankind. Apocalypse in the Bible, it means the total destruction and end of the world. So we can use the either or, either eschatology or apocalypse, okay? So eschatology is a noun and the adjective is eschatological. Apocalypse is also a noun and the adjective is apocalyptic. Both words, both terms refer to the end of the world. That's why, for example, now during the COVID-19 pandemic, many people have been referring to this as the apocalypse. So Fire and Ice is a work of eschatology. It's an apocalyptic poem. It writes about the end of the world and it poses two possible causes for this end, two possible scenarios. The world is going to end either by fire or by ice. And of course, fire and ice are two natural elements. These are two elements taken from nature. Yet, those two elements are symbols. Fire as a natural element is used as a symbol for desire, extreme passion. Sometimes we can say fiery emotions. While ice with all the coldness is used as a symbol of hatred and indifference. The poet argues that both emotions, because desire is an emotion and hatred as well is an emotion. It is an emotion, well, a negative one, but an emotion. So the poet argues that both emotions have the capacity to destroy the world. Let's go back to the poem. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. Then he allocates two lines for fire. From what I have tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. So fire here is a symbol of desire, which is an emotion. So extreme emotions, strong extreme emotions could actually destroy the world. But if it had to perish twice, as if this is a choice, it's not a choice. That's why we call this a scenario. If the world had to perish twice, had to end twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. So he's equating here hate with ice. That's why we say ice is a symbol of hate. So actually, the title itself, Fire and Ice, these are two symbols of two extreme strong emotions, desire and hate. Extreme strong emotions could destroy the world. Think of a fiery passion. A fiery passion can burn everything, can destroy everything. Think of cold hate, cold, deep hate. That could also destroy the world. Now think of fire and ice. Both elements burn the skin. Both burn the skin, fire and ice. So they have the same strength. They are equal. So the two natural elements are used as symbols for desire and hatred. So the poem is not about fire and ice. The poem is about desire and hate as strong emotions that could lead to the apocalypse. Let's speak more about fire. Now, by fire, the speaker actually means desire. And he said, from what I've tasted, which means from the speaker's limited personal experience, he knows desire to be a powerfully destructive force. In other words, humanity, human beings, could bring the end of the world through passion, strong passions like anger, violence, greed, desire for more money, desire for more food, for more water, for more resources, and bloodlust. Now, indeed, the fire now seems like an image of war too. Remember, the poem was written shortly after the end of the First World War. So fire stands for such strong, destructive emotions. Though the speaker feels fire is the probable, the possible, the likely way for humanity to destroy itself and the world, he also feels that human beings' capacity for destruction is so great that it could bring about this destruction more than once. Now, this is the ironic part in the poem when he said, but if it had to perish twice, which means that human beings have a huge capacity for destruction, as if they are going to destroy the world twice. At this point, the speaker presents ice as another method for ending it all, for ending the world. And it is aligned with hatred. Now, ice works differently from fire in this eschatological, apocalyptic prediction. Human destruction doesn't have to be bright, noisy, violent, because remember, in fire, we said anger, violence, greed, bloodlust, and then we can think of war. No, actually, the word human destruction can be very quiet. Hate can spread quietly in subtle ways. And of course, ice has connotations of coldness, indifference, connotations, you know the meaning of this word, دلالات of coldness and indifference, لا مبالاة. So while fire is bright, very bright, ice is very subtle, cold and indifferent. Yet by the poem's end, the choice between ice and fire starts to seem a bit false. Actually, there is no choice because both are equal. Strong destructive emotions are the same as cold hatred and indifference. So it's not about a choice. There is no choice. It seems this choice is a little bit false, particularly as the speaker's tone is so casual and conversational. Some say, as if he's gossiping, you know. Some people say the world will end in fire. Some say it will end in ice. So this is a very conversational, casual tone, and even glib. Glib is the person who sounds so confident, and he's very spontaneous. He doesn't think. He just articulates his ideas. Ice is also great. This is how the poem ends. And would suffice. Suffice, of course, means it's the verb that comes from the word sufficient. Ice is also great and would suffice, would be enough for the end of the world. So we realize that the two scenarios are the same. Ice and fire are different in the literal sense, of course. Of course, ice is different from fire. They are even, they stand in contrast. But in this poem, they represent one and the same thing, which is the destructive potential of humanity. Humanity has the capacity to destroy itself and to end the world through strong, violent, fiery passions and cold hatred and indifference. So either method, whether it's fire or ice, will suffice to bring about the end of the world. See, this is a poem that is written in one stanza, and the stanza consists of 9 lines. Very condensed, مكثفة, as if it offers a warning about human nature, because it alerts our attention to the fact that we human beings can destroy the world, end the world through our actions and feelings, either destructive, fiery emotions or cold hatred and indifference. Let's look at some literary devices in this poem. Now, the opening two lines of Fire and Ice establish two important aspects of the overall poem. In the very first two lines, firstly, these two lines make it clear that this poem is a work of eschatology, a work of apocalypse. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. So the mentioning the word will end, immediately we understand that this poem is a work of eschatology. It's about the end of the world. Second aspect, what is so important about those first two lines in the poem is that they establish the poem's conversational tone. Conversational, as if the poet is in conversation with another person. Yet this conversational, light, spontaneous tone stands in contrast, in extreme contrast to the seriousness, the heaviness of the subject matter of the poem, the end of the word. So we have two things here in contrast. The tone stands in stark contrast to the subject of the poem, which is the end of the word. The first two lines also set up the poem's key antithesis. This is how we pronounce it, antithesis. You know, we have thesis and antithesis or antithesis. The next slide is an explanation of the meaning of antithesis. Let's try to understand first how this concept is established, then we will get the definition. Now, the speaker considers whether fire or ice will bring about the end of the world. This early stage in the poem, the first two lines, the symbolic meaning of these two natural elements is not yet clear. He doesn't tell us. We have no idea what fire and ice stand for. The symbolic meaning of the two natural elements, fire and ice, is not clear yet. We're talking about the first two lines. And the speaker talks in a very simple language. Now, this is all about providing the reader with a false sense of security. The first two lines are or have a very simple conversational tone. And we said that this in itself stands in contrast to the heaviness, the gravity of the subject matter of the poem. So why would the poet do that? It's just about providing the reader with a false sense of security. But line by line and gradually, the poem reveals the depth of its thought. When we start understanding the symbols, that fire is a symbol of strong passions, desire, and ice stands for cold hate. The lines were speaking all this about only the first 2 lines. The lines are balanced by anaphora. Remember the anaphora? We spoke about that in the poem of William Wordsworth, anaphora. That is the repetition of the same word or phrase at the beginning of the sentence. Some say the word will end in fire, some say in ice. So it's some say. And this anaphora allows for the antithesis to be established. What is an antithesis? 2 things that are in contrast. On one side, there is fire. On the other, there is ice. Actually, the speaker presents 2 choices. But towards the end of the poem, and line by line, we realize that they amount to the same thing. So not only the poem is very short and condensed, but also it generates lots of meanings in the first 2 lines. All this on the screen is about the first 2 lines of the poem. And when you read them, they are very simple. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. A very light conversational tone, but it stands in contrast to the seriousness and gravity of the subject matter, which is the end of the world. Now here is antithesis. What's the meaning of this term? Antithesis is a figure of speech. A figure of speech that does what? It juxtaposes 2 contrasting or opposing ideas, usually within parallel grammatical structures. Some say the world will end in fire, some say the world will end in ice. Together, the 2 lines emphasize the incredible contrast between the 2 elements, fire and ice. Yet, towards the end of the poem, we realize that they are the same. So please remember that antithesis is a figure of speech and not a literary device. Antithesis is a figure of speech. 2 contrasting or opposing ideas are juxtaposed together, usually within parallel grammatical structures. Now, there is something ironic about the poem here. But we need to understand what is irony at the beginning, to understand what is so ironic about the poem. Now, what is irony in Arabic? Irony is what we call, it has many names in Arabic, but to understand the exact meaning we work with here, it means mufarqa. Because some people translate irony as sukhriya. No, it's not sukhriya. No. Now, irony is a literary device or event in which how things seem to be very different from how they actually are. So It's this difference between reality and the appearance. That's why things become ironic sometimes. So sometimes you see a person and you would never imagine that this person could be, for example, a historian or a philosopher because of the way he carries himself around. Then it becomes so ironic that you realize that how this person seems to be is very different from how he really is. This is just one simple form of irony. Now, where is still the irony in this poem? How can the word perish twice? The poet says, but if it had to perish twice. Now, if the word ends, that's it. We're not going to repeat that. It ends and that's it. So how can the word perish twice? Now, it's ironic that the word would perish with fire and then again perish with ice. Also, there is irony in the persona's stand. Stand here means position. Now, first, he told us that he favors, I hold with those who favor fire. Then he again says, okay, ice is also great and would suffers. So this is very ironic. He agrees with all of them. Now, irony, of course, is a very broad term, very broad. And under irony, there are 3 different types. Each has its own specific definition. There is verbal irony, that is through language. There is dramatic irony, that has to do with characters in the play, for example, and situational irony. Situational irony relates to a situation, irony in a specific situation. Of course, what we have here is verbal irony that appears in the tone of the poem. We call the tone conversational, light, and ironic. What is the proof of that? This line about the word, if it had to perish twice, and also about the position of the speaker. First, he agrees with those who favor fire, and then he agrees with those who favor ice. I just decided that it's a very good coincidence that the poem introduces us to another literary device that you will come across several times in poetry. I want you first to look at the example. Of course, it's taken from the poem. But if it had to perish twice, now this is a line of verse. Usually we stop at the end. This is how we read poetry, line by line. But if it had to perish twice, then if we stop here, the sentence doesn't make sense. You have to continue. I think I know enough of hate. What does that mean? You have to continue. I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice, you have to continue, is also great and would suffice. Now, when the meaning does not end with the line, We're speaking about poetry only when the meaning does not end with the end of the line and it continues, the sentence continues. This is what we call enjambment. Enjambment. This is a literary device in which a line of poetry carries its idea or thought to the next line without a grammatical pause. If you notice, those 5 lines are just one sentence. 5 lines are one sentence. With enjambment, the end of a poetic phrase extends past the end of the poetic line. So you have to continue reading in order to understand the poetic phrase, because it does not end with the end of the line. Well, this means that the thought or the idea steps over the line, the end of a line in a poem, and it goes to the next line. The absence of punctuation, there is nothing after hate, nothing after ice, nothing after great, and what we get after twice is a comma. So the absence of punctuation allows for enjambment and requires the reader to read through a poem's line break without pausing in order to understand the conclusion of the thought. Now that's very simple. Let me wrap this up again. What is enjambment? The idea does not end with the end of the line. It goes over to the next line. So the point is, you have to be aware of that. Because if you read just one line and you stop, it's not going to make sense for you. You have to continue reading to understand the whole idea. This is one sentence. So you have to continue reading till the end in order to understand the conclusion. I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. So this is a new literary device that we are introduced to. Now we know the anaphora and we know the enjambment. In addition, of course, to all the other things we know: personification, metaphor, symbols. Here is a very quick question. I just decided to end this lesson with a very simple question. What is the meaning of "if it had to perish twice"? A, fire can only end the world once, but ice will require to destroy it twice. Therefore, fire is stronger than ice. Or B, if fire fails the first time, then ice can be used to finish the job, to end the world. C, both of the above are possible. That is, A is possible and B is possible. So what could be the correct answer? Is it A or B or C? And when you get a question like this, you need to go back to the analysis of the poem. You need to go back to the poem and read. At the beginning, you might think that fire and ice are contrasting. But towards the end of the poem, we realize that they amount to the same thing. Both could end the world. So what does it mean if it had to perish twice? Does it mean that fire will end half of the world and then ice will destroy the rest? Does this mean that fire is stronger than ice? Definitely this is wrong, since fire and ice are equal in the poem. If fire fails the first time, then ice can be used the second time. That's the correct answer. Let's read the poem one last time to get the feel of the end of the world. Fire and Ice by Robert Frost. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and it suffers. So we hope we do not destroy the world through our hate or strong passions. Thank you very much, and we'll meet next time with also another poem. And next time it's going to be a poem by William Blake, the English poet.